Okay, let's unpack this. When we think about modern warfare, the image that often comes to mind is, well, it's detached, almost clinical, isn't it?
Yeah, like joysticks, screens, precision strikes, maybe from thousands of miles away.
Exactly. It feels like technology has somehow, I don't know, abstracted or even sanitized conflict, maybe even made the foot soldier, the infantryman, kind of a relic.
But the stack of sources you've shared with us, they tell a fundamentally different story, a much grittier one.
Right.
These sources really drill down into the enduring, messy, and intensely human reality of ground combat. They focus specifically on the infantrymen.
And they're drawing insights from historical accounts, looking at what war is actually like for the soldier on the ground, kind of stripping away the theories and predictions.
That's the core of it. And our mission in this deep dive really is to pull out those essential, maybe undeniable truths about the foot soldier's experience.
So we're contrasting that often clean theoretical view we get from afar with the,
Right.
well, the muddy, bloody reality.
Yeah, and trying to understand why, despite all the incredible technological advancements, the infantryman remains absolutely crucial.
And crucially, this isn't speculation, right?
Yeah.
It's grounded in historical study, actual events.
Absolutely. And what's fascinating here, is how consistently predictions about the foot soldier's demise have been proven wrong over and over again throughout history.
Why is that?
Well, the sources make the point that these theories, they're often based on hypothetical scenarios, on how people wish war could be, maybe, rather than the messy reality of combat.
Oh, okay.
As one quote puts it, theories are meant to be debunked, especially in relation to warfare. This idea that war can somehow be sanitized or transformed.
By making it look like video monitors, joysticks, push buttons, and expensive gadgets.
Exactly. It just collapses when it meets the ground. The reality is just different.
Right, and we've seen attempts to execute war based on those clean theories, only to have reality immediately intervene. Like, think about the shock and awe plan for the 2003 Iraq invasion.
Oh, yeah. The theory was swift. Precise air power would paralyze the regime. Ground forces could, bypass cities, and they'd largely be welcomed as liberators.
A plan built on bypassing resistance, essentially.
Right. But that theory was immediately contradicted by the reality on the ground. Those bypass cities, especially the urban environments, became significant challenges, major
So
obstacles.
the plan based on precision strikes
Yeah.
and just rolling past the hard parts,
Yeah.
it kind of dissolved.
Pretty quickly, yeah. When ground troops encountered the unexpected, which was, determined human resistance in really complex terrain.
Which really sets the stage for what these sources spend so much time on the unchanging, brutal face of battle for the person actually on the ground.
It does. And a critical shift in how history even studied this came with John Keegan's landmark book, The Face of Battle.
That book really changed things, didn't it?
It was revolutionary, yeah, because it deliberately moved away from the traditional historical focus, the generals, the grand strategy, the sweeping charges, trumpets, and glory.
Right, the view from the top.
He turned the lens onto the actual experience of the common soldier in combat, and that inspired a whole wave of historical research into that perspective.
And before that, as the sources note, first-hand accounts from the average enlisted soldier were, oh, they were almost non-existent until relatively recently.
Exactly. So we had this distant, often romanticized view. But these sources, they give us those raw, unfiltered details. And they show us just how consistent the core experience of ground combat is across vastly different wars.
So let's get into some of those details. Where do we see that consistency?
Well, you see it immediately in how the physical environment itself becomes a relentless enemy. I mean, just look at the Pacific Theater in World War II. Places like Guam and Peleliu.
The island hopping campaign. Brutal.
Unbelievably so. The heat wasn't just uncomfortable, it was debilitating. We're talking 105 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade, pushing 115 in the open sun.
Just impossible conditions to fight in.
And water, incredibly scarce. Men drank their canteens dry within the first few hours, and the water they could find was often awful, described as tasting of rust and oil, sometimes with a visible blue film on the surface. Imagine having to drink that.
So just surviving the environment was a battle in itself.
Absolutely. And the terrain on those islands, difficult toral ridges, often almost vertical, and they were honeycombed with Japanese cave defenses.
Right, dug deep into the rock.
Caves that were blasted into the almost perpendicular coral ridges, often sealed with actual steel doors and incredibly well camouflaged. They gave the defenders perfect, protected firing positions.
Devastating.
And Peleliu in particular was described as incomparably worse than Guam in its bloodiness, terror, climate, just hellish.
Okay, so contrast that heat and coral with, say, the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge. Winter 1944.
Total opposite, right. Instead of heat and coral, it was relentless snow and mud, dense fir and pine forests.
Visibility must have been terrible.
Reduced to just 100, 150 yards sometimes, making it feel, as one source says, almost seem like night. And narrow fields of fire turned every small clearing or trail into a potential ambush point, a death trap.
And then you have the jungle, Vietnam, Doc 2.
Yeah, described simply as a lousy place to fight a war. Just getting through the dense bamboo, the thick vines, the moldy detritus on that harsh terrain was exhausting. And that's before you even found the enemy.
Right, the jungle itself fighting against you.
And then jump forward again, urban combat. Places like Fallujah, Tikrit in Iraq.
Different kind of density.
Exactly. Dense urban structures, narrow streets, and the sheer heat again reaching 130 degrees in the summer, compounded by dangers hidden in ubiquitous trash piles which could hide IEDs.
So the environment. It's never just a backdrop, is it? It's an active participant.
It's a constant, draining challenge that shapes every single action. Always.
Okay, so beyond the environment, the sources really emphasize the sheer violence and physical horror. That seems to be other concepts.
Absolutely. The overwhelming experience of bombardments, for instance, like at Guam, where ships offshore spewed 16-inch shells. Men could literally feel the concussion in their chests just from the air blast. Imagine that power.
Just overwhelming sensory input.
And the constant, immediate threat of being hit. The sources are full of these, well, gut-wrenching details. Corporal Costello watching his friend Joe Reed shot in the forehead right next to him. The quote is chilling. The blood seeped out of a small hole. He had a blank stare.
Oh, man.
Private William Martin narrowly avoiding a mortar shell that split just 3 feet in front of him, realizing he'd just come so close to having his head blown off. It's that random, instant threat.
And the aftermath. The sources don't sanitize that either.
Not at all. They describe the grisly scenes, severed arms and legs on the beach at Peleliu, dead Japs, like so many animals, enemy dead piled 2 and 3 deep, the ground slick with blood.
Just horrific imagery.
Water in the foxholes turning into a reddish-brown, muddy liquid. Decapitated bodies from shell fire in the Ardennes. Wounded soldiers' life's blood oozing out in the waist-deep snow, turning it to crimson red.
And Dactyl Hill 875.
Descriptions there of American bodies along with enemy bodies were all entwined on the jungle floor, covered in blood, some blown apart, creating this overwhelming stench of death. It's visceral.
And tragically, the violence isn't always from the enemy. You mentioned friendly fire.
Yeah. One of the most horrific examples highlighted is that incident at Dactyl Hill 875. A bomb, an American bomb, killed 42 Americans and wounded 45.
Just devastating.
Survivors described the injury as a stump of his left arm, legs are gone, a shattered elbow, and Lieutenant Remington, himself wounded, desperately radioing, "Stop those fucking airplanes, they're killing us up here." That's the brutal, indiscriminate reality of combat on the ground.
Facing all of that, I mean, the psychological toll must be immense.
Absolutely crushing. The constant gnawing fear is pervasive. One infantryman describes his stomach had been tied in knots basically the whole time.
You just live with it.
Another recounts pure panic, experiencing physical symptoms like difficulty breathing, losing dexterity, just overwhelming fear.
And the cumulative effect.
Battle shock, exhaustion. You see it in the physical descriptions of the men. Young, old faces, the 1,000-yard stare of battle shock in their eyes, cracked lips parched with dried blood.
The 1,000-yard stare.
Yeah, men literally wilted on Peleliu with, get this, as many casualties from heat prostration as from wounds. The environment was as deadly as the enemy.
Wow.
In Tikrit, the sheer heat and tension left soldiers mentally exhausted, and survivors at Dactyl were often found in a state of mental shock, listless, wide-eyed, just broken.
And the struggle with fear itself, that must be deeply personal and brutal.
It is. There's the story of Spady in the bunker at Dactyl, just crying uncontrollably, screaming, "They're going to kill us, we're going to die."
Total breakdown.
And the sources point out, the merciless nature of combat means even strong units are only as strong as their weakest link in that moment of terror. It puts incredible pressure on everyone.
But then, paradoxically, you mentioned some soldiers find a strange kind of peace.
Yeah, it's hard to understand from the outside, but Lieutenant Kelly at Dactyl, believing he would certainly die, felt a calmness came over me in accepting that reality. Maybe a letting go.
A strange sort of acceptance.
And while these sources don't delve into long-term trauma like survivor's guilt in massive detail, the intensity of these experiences, I mean, it clearly implies profound and lasting psychological impacts. How could it not?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so if that's the unchanging, brutal reality of the environment as an enemy, the raw violence, the crushing psychological burden, why is the foot soldier still indispensable in modern warfare? With all the tech we have, why can't we solve this from a distance?
Well, because technology, as the sources make really clear, it just cannot do the job alone. It's a tool, a powerful one, but not a replacement.
How so?
Naval and air units could assist, bombard, support, but they couldn't take physical land objectives themselves. That was the mission on places like Guam. Someone has to put boots on the ground.
Okay.
UAVs, predators, incredibly useful for surveillance, reconnaissance, even targeted strikes. But ultimately, as one soldier puts it in Fallujah, you still need an infantryman peering under that cabinet to clear a room, to secure a building, to actually hold ground. Technology can't do that final physical step.
So the infantry are still the lead actors, as one source put it.
Exactly. Nothing could be taken, nothing could be held without the foot troops taking the lead. We saw that on Peleliu. The riflemen led the way and faced the greatest dangers on those brutal ridges. They had to.
And especially in urban combat, right? Which seems increasingly common.
Fundamentally requires the infantryman. It's methodical, block-by-block fighting, like in Aachen back in World War II. It demands adapting to confined spaces, navigating buildings, clearing room by room.
Close, dirty work.
Fallujah, as described in the sources, required a grueling, on-the-ground, dirty, extended period of combat and manual labor. Marines had to clear every single building, engaging in difficult house-to-house fights, often getting trapped or isolated. It's incredibly dangerous and demanding.
And success in those close quarters, complex environments, it often hinges on small unit actions, doesn't it? And individual bravery.
Absolutely critical. Look at Sergeant Travellini at Buchholz in the Ardennes. Single-handedly using a grenade bazooka fire, his M1 rifle, broke up an attack. Made such a difference, he earned a battlefield commission right there.
Wow. On the spot.
Corporal Andrzejowski and others on Peleliu using grenades and shooting Japanese soldiers point blank. The source calls this the very essence of the infantryman's decidedly personal war. It's face-to-face.
And Sergeant Belavia in Fallujah. That story is intense.
Unbelievable. Close quarters, fighting in a house, a pistol fight, a knife fight, facing down a young insurgent, and then surviving the explosion of his suicide vest at arm's length. Just raw survival and combat skill.
It's almost primal.
And Corporal Casal's methodical technique of pieing a room and, scanning slices of the room before entering saved his life at handshake distance. Small techniques matter hugely.
Right.
Private First Class Nathan Wood, charging a machine gun to distract it and save his buddies, paying the ultimate price. Private Hugh Berger in the Ardennes in a desperate knife fight, knowing he had to act fast or die. Spec 4, Cecil Millspaugh, charging NVA soldiers with his M60 machine gun and just slaughtered the NVA soldiers at nearly back-slapping range.
These are moments of just raw, individual courage. Technology doesn't replicate that.
No, it doesn't, and that highlights the critical importance of leadership, not just at the general level, but right down at the small unit level. Squads, platoons.
Having those leaders on the spot.
Yeah, having plenty of good thinkers on the spot, making sense out of nonsense, as one source described it on Peleliu. Captain Hunt's leadership securing a crucial point, a great small unit infantry accomplishment. Lieutenant Cecil's expertise putting his platoon on point at DAC 2. Sergeant Belavia leading his team against a multi-directional attack for hours. These are the leaders who make the decisive difference in the chaos.
And we shouldn't overlook the specialized infantry roles either, right? The one supporting the riflemen.
Absolutely essential. War dogs were vital at Guam for detecting infiltrators at night. Medics, known intimately as DOC or Baksai in Vietnam, treating the wounded under intense fire.
The risks they took were incredible.
Administering first aid, giving morphine, even crossing open ground while wounded themselves to reach more casualties. Like Lieutenant Kind and Private First Class John Trahan at DOC to amazing bravery.
And the medics and the CAPs.
Yeah, the combined action platoons in Vietnam where Marines lived in villages with local militia. The medics there were crucial in bridging cultural gaps through MedCaps, medical civic action programs, treating villagers for everything from headaches to actual war wounds, building trust.
That's a different kind of frontline work.
Yeah.
And engineers.
Yeah.
Especially in cities.
Indispensable in urban environments, using explosives like C4, satchel charges, bangalores, different kinds of demolition charges to breach buildings, cause fires, like in Fallujah.
Creating openings.
And assault men using SMA debuts, those shoulder-launched multi-purpose assault weapons provided fire support and created entry holes through walls. They called it mouse holing, similar to how bazookas were used to punch through buildings way back in Aiken.
So it's a whole ecosystem supporting that infantryman leading the charge.
Definitely. The sources also touch on how different strategic approaches impact the infantrymen and the conflict itself. Especially in Vietnam, this comes up a lot.
Right, the Westmoreland approach versus others.
Exactly. General Westmoreland favored the big unit war, focusing on large search and destroy missions, aiming for a crossover point based on enemy body counts, kill more of them than they can replace.
Using firepower mobility helicopters.
Right. Geographic objectives were often less important than killing enemy soldiers in that strategy.
And that was contrasted with the Marine Corps CCAPs, the combined action platoons.
Completely different approach. Living among the people in villages with local PF Popular Force militia, focusing on pacification, local security, winning hearts and minds, essentially.
So what was the tension there?
Well, Westmoreland saw the CAPs as fragmenting his limited resources. He wanted to focus on destroying the main North Vietnamese army forces, what he called the bully boys.
Go after the big units.
But advocates for the CAPs, dealing with the local Viet Cong guerrillas, the termites, as they were sometimes called, saw pacification as essential to winning the war long term. They argued you couldn't just kill your way to victory against an insurgency that's rooted in the population.
Two very different philosophies of war.
And the sources highlight the consequences of that big unit, heavy firepower approach. It often caused civilian casualties, like the little girl wounded by artillery fire mentioned in one account. It displaced refugees, leading to immense anguish and property destruction.
And potentially alienated the population.
Arguably, yeah. Making the countryside less secure for American forces in the long run because you lose local support or even create enemies. It's complex.
Even the names of operations were sensitive, apparently.
Right. Masher had to be changed to White Wing because President Johnson thought Masher sounded too aggressive, too warlike for public consumption, politics playing a role even there.
And these kinds of tactical and strategic debates continued, right, into recent conflicts.
Oh, absolutely. Louis II saw differences between the Army and Marine approaches. The Army, often more armor-heavy, tended towards a faster advance, using firepower to sort of reduce buildings before sending infantry in, soften them up first.
Okay.
The Marines were generally more deliberate, focusing on methodical, building-by-building clearing, go in and clear it physically.
Did that cause friction?
Yeah, it led to friction, arguments over who was being slow, debates about which method was more thorough, or maybe incurred more casualties, either friendly or civilian, different ways of tackling the same problem.
And you mentioned a shift later in the Iraq War, too, around 2005.
Right. The perceived ineffectiveness of the FOB-centric war, FOBs, are forward operating bases, basically commuting to war from these large, secure bases. Soldiers spent a lot of time just traveling, less time engaging with the population.
Okay, less presence.
That was contrasted with the later surge approach, which involved living among the people in smaller combat outposts right in the neighborhoods.
More like the CAP idea.
Sort of, yeah. And that dramatically reduced insurgent influence and improved security, largely by fostering relationships, gathering intelligence directly, just being present.
So across all these conflicts, different approaches, different technological eras, what's the fundamental truth that keeps coming through from these sources?
It boils down to this. War is ultimately a human endeavor. It's always more than killing. Technology can make killing more efficient, sure, but it will never stop a determined enemy.
The human element remains key.
As Adrian Lewis is quoted saying, the human brain and the human spirit are the greatest weapons on the earth. That really captures it.
And you see that truth embodied in just the incredible endurance and resilience of the infantrymen that these sources describe.
Definitely. Fighting through extreme heat, thirst, exhaustion, fear, boredom, physical discomfort for days, weeks, months on end. Learning that you can survive IEDs, weathering constant threats that would just break most people.
And amid all that hardship, you also see these acts of almost unbelievable courage, selflessness, and honor.
It's astounding sometimes. The story of medic Jason Barnes at DAC 2, sacrificing himself by falling on a grenade to save others, he earned the Medal of Honor.
Just incredible selflessness.
And the description, his expression showing fright and fear, but also seeming to convey question in his final moments before bleeding to death, it's just profoundly human.
And the priest on Hill 875.
Yeah, moving among the wounded under fire, dispensing water, even holy water or wine, apparently praying, talking, simply being present, keeping spirits up. Soldiers called him their hero. He wasn't even armed. Lieutenant Kine grabbing a wounded man's rifle to return fire while treating him. Private First Class John Trahan treating 18 men, then crossing open ground while wounded himself to reach more casualties. These aren't anomalies. The sources show they are part of the infantry experience, that level of commitment.
And perhaps most central to all of this, threading through everything, is that profound bond of brotherhood you mentioned.
Absolutely fundamental.
Yeah.
Infantrymen fight primarily for one another. Nothing more, nothing less, as one source states plainly.
It's about the person next to you.
This brotherhood is forged in that shared brutal experience. It marks them forever and is often described as the most powerful phenomenon they will experience. It's what keeps them putting one foot in front of the other when they see friends killed right beside them, that bond.
And coping with this reality,
Mm-hmm.
it must be a constant struggle.
Huge. Battle, as the sources describe it, is a far cry from the romanticized Hollywood version. It's often a disjointed series of action. Long periods of boredom punctuated by moments of absolute terror.
Whiplash.
The physical and mental toll is immense, and simple, immediate coping mechanisms emerge. Smoking cigarettes in distressingly high numbers, dipping snuff just to combat exhaustion, stay awake, stay alert.
Whatever gets you through.
Yeah. And then layered on top of all that, the physical and psychological fight is the information war, especially in more recent conflicts.
How does that play out?
Insurgents using media like Al Jazeera, the internet, using it very effectively to control the narrative, spread anti-American propaganda, fuel hatred, and specifically target the American public's will to fight.
So attacking the home front, essentially.
Targeting the will of the American people to continue this faraway war, as one source puts it, it becomes another battlefield.
And that must create a frustrating challenge for those on the ground trying to get the truth out right.
Hugely frustrating. Lieutenant Colonel Funk's experience is mentioned, dealing with reporters who didn't embed, who relied on distant interviews, and potentially painted an unfair or incomplete picture.
Because they weren't seeing the reality firsthand.
Right. Tragic accidents, like friendly fire, could be portrayed very negatively without the full context of the chaos, the fog of war, making it really difficult to counter the insurgent narrative effectively from the front lines. Getting the truth out becomes incredibly hard.
So wrapping up this deep dive then, what we've really seen from these sources is that the reality of ground combat for the infantrymen is incredibly enduring. It's messy. And it's stubbornly resistant to being sanitized by technology or simplified by neat theories.
Yeah, that's a great summary. The infantryman remains absolutely essential for taking and holding ground, for navigating complex environments like cities, and for winning that critical close-quarters fight. Technology supports them, yes, but it fundamentally does not replace them.
And the cost is just immense, physical and psychological. Marked by constant exposure to brutal violence, environmental extremes, pervasive fear, bone-deep exhaustion.
Yet amid all that, we see these incredible acts of small unit leadership, individual bravery, and that powerful, life-defining bond of brotherhood. That seems to be what drives men to fight for one another above all else.
And we also touched on how different strategic approaches, like the big unit search and destroy versus the combined action platoons in Vietnam, or different tactical approaches in Fallujah, had vastly different consequences, particularly for the civilian population and in gaining or losing local support.
Definitely. The human element, courage, brotherhood, will, and that information war component, they're just as strategically important as any weapon system. Maybe more so in the long run.
So here's something for you, the listener, to consider. Given this constant, brutal reality faced by the infantrymen across so many conflicts, a reality that seems resistant to technological fixes and strategic theories that often fail on contact with the ground truth, what does that tell us about the fundamental nature of war itself?
And what does it tell us about the profound cost asked of those who fight it on the ground, face to face?
Yeah. How do we reconcile the messy, intensely human reality of close combat described so vividly in these sources with our attempts to conceptualize war from a distance, mediated by screens and statistics?
That's something worth thinking about long after this deep dive is done.